The silk blouse felt foreign against my skin as I smoothed it one final time, my reflection in the hallway mirror revealing a woman I barely recognized. At 63, I'd grown accustomed to seeing myself in comfortable cardigans and sensible shoes, the uniform of someone who'd learned to make herself small, invisible, forgettable. But today was different. Today, I was meeting my daughter for lunch at the Meridian, the kind of restaurant where Alexia Emerson had insisted we meet to discuss some important family matters. The phrase had been echoing in my mind for 3 days now, each repetition adding another layer of dread to my already churning stomach. In my experience, nothing good ever came from Alexia's family discussions. They usually involved her explaining, with that practiced patience she reserved for speaking to children and the elderly, why I needed to make better choices about my life. I grabbed my worn leather purse, the same one I'd carried for 8 years now, and checked its contents one more time. $47 in cash, my debit card linked to an account with $3,100, and a business card that had been tucked behind my driver's license for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. Harrison and Associates, Wealth Management, a relic from another life when such things had mattered. The drive to the Meridian took 23 minutes through downtown Portland, past the boutiques and galleries I used to frequent without thinking twice about the prices. Now I drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic with the prayer that it would start each morning, careful to avoid the valet parking and find a spot 3 blocks away where the meters only cost $0.25 an hour. Alexia was already seated when I arrived, her perfectly highlighted hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. At 38, she'd inherited her father's sharp features and business acumen, but none of his warmth. She wore success like expensive perfume, subtle but unmistakable, designed to remind everyone in her vicinity of exactly where they stood in comparison. "Mom, you made it," she said, rising to offer me a brief, careful hug that wouldn't disturb her makeup. "You look nice." The pause before nice lasted exactly long enough to catalog everything wrong with my appearance. The blouse from Nordstrom Rack that I'd convinced myself looked expensive enough. The shoes that were comfortable but clearly not designer. The absence of the jewelry I'd quietly sold over the past 5 years to supplement my Social Security payments. "Thank you, sweetheart. You look beautiful as always." I settled into the chair across from her, noting how she'd chosen a table in the center of the dining room where her presence would be noticed by the other patrons. Alexia had always been conscious of being seen. She was already reviewing the wine list with the focused attention she usually reserved for quarterly profit reports. I took the liberty of ordering us the tasting menu. "I hope that's all right? I know you've been economizing lately." There it was. The first gentle thrust of the knife, delivered with a smile that would fool anyone watching from another table. I managed to keep my expression neutral, a skill I'd developed through years of practice. "That's very thoughtful of you, dear." The sommelier appeared as if summoned by Alexia's mere presence, offering recommendations for wine pairings that cost more per glass than I typically spent on groceries in a week. I watched my daughter nod knowingly at his suggestions, her manicured fingers tapping against the white tablecloth in a rhythm I recognized from her childhood, the same impatient percussion she'd drummed whenever she was building up to something unpleasant. "So," she began once we were alone again, "I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving." My chest tightened. Thanksgiving was still 6 weeks away, but Alexia approached holiday planning with the strategic precision of a military campaign. "Of course, I've been looking forward to it." "Well, that's what I wanted to discuss." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on that carefully modulated tone she used during difficult business negotiations. "Richard and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if we kept this year's celebration a bit smaller." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished candle. I felt my hands begin to tremble slightly and clasped them together in my lap, beneath the table where she couldn't see. "Smaller? It's just that the kids are getting older now. Emma's 15 and Jordan's 13, and they have so many activities, so many friends they want to include. And Richard's parents are flying in from Seattle, which already makes 9 people." She trailed off, allowing the implication to settle. 9 people. Everyone except me. "I see." My voice sounded remarkably steady, though something cold and sharp was spreading through my chest. And you think adding one more person would be overwhelming? Alexia's smile flickered, the first crack in her perfectly composed facade. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's not about you personally. It's just that… She paused, seemingly searching for the right words. Well, the truth is, things have been a bit awkward lately. Richard's family, they're successful people. His father just retired as a senior partner at his law firm, and his mother sits on 3 different charity boards. They're used to a certain atmosphere. You know what I mean. Everyone contributes to the conversation about travel, about business, about current events. And lately, you've seemed… Another pause. Another careful calibration of cruelty. Well, you've seemed a bit disconnected from those kinds of discussions. Richard mentioned that last Christmas when his mother was talking about their cruise to the Mediterranean. You seemed uncomfortable. The memory crashed over me like a wave. Richard's mother, Beverly Bono, describing in vivid detail their 3-week luxury cruise while I sat silent, acutely aware that I hadn't taken a vacation in 4 years. I remembered excusing myself to the bathroom and standing in front of the mirror, trying to summon the dignity to return to the table and pretend that her casual mention of the cost, only $12,000 per person, really quite reasonable, hadn't made me want to disappear entirely. I was listening, I said quietly. I was interested in her travels. I know you were, Mom, but that's exactly what I mean. You were just listening, not participating. And it makes everyone feel awkward when one person clearly can't relate to the conversation. The first course arrived, some architectural arrangement of microgreens and foam that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. I stared at it while Alexia continued her careful dismantling of my place in the family. The thing is, we want everyone to feel comfortable, including you. And I think you'd be more comfortable having a quiet day at home, maybe watching some movies, ordering in. I could bring you a plate of leftovers the next day. Leftovers. Like a stray dog being thrown scraps from the family table. I set down my fork and looked directly at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time since I'd arrived. Her face was composed, professional. The expression she wore when delivering bad news to clients or employees. There was no trace of the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. No hint of the teenager who'd sobbed in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart. Alexia, I said slowly, are you telling me that I'm not welcome at Thanksgiving because I'm poor? Her cheeks flushed slightly, but her voice remained steady. I'm telling you that we want what's best for everyone. And right now, what's best is for you to understand that some situations require a certain social fluency that you might not feel equipped to handle. The words hit me like a physical blow, but something strange happened. Instead of crumbling, instead of apologizing and accepting this latest humiliation with grace, I felt something else entirely. A clean, white-hot anger that cut through years of accumulated shame and self-doubt. I reached for my purse, my movements deliberate and calm. I think I understand perfectly. Mom, please don't be dramatic. This isn't personal. It's entirely personal. I stood, my legs steadier than they'd been in months. And you're absolutely right about one thing. I don't belong at your table. Alexia's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. Where are you going? We haven't even discussed… The bill, I finished. Don't worry. I'm sure you can handle it with your social fluency. I walked out of the Meridian with my head high, past the startled hostess and the curious stares of other diners. It wasn't until I reached my car that I allowed myself to shake, not with fear or shame, but with something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. That evening, I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside me, and the business card I'd carried for so long spread flat against the worn Formica surface. Harrison and Associates. Wealth Management. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number, my fingers steady now. Harrison and Associates. This is Janet Waters speaking. Hello, Janet. This is Diane Carson. I'd like to speak with someone about liquidating some assets. The Harrison and Associates building hadn't changed much in the 15 years since I'd last walked through its glass doors. The same marble floors, the same subdued lighting, The same atmosphere of quiet prosperity that used to make me feel secure and now made me feel like an intruder. But I wasn't the same woman who used to belong here, and today that felt like an advantage rather than a loss. Janet Waters met me in the lobby, her professional smile wavering slightly when she saw my modest appearance. I could practically see her mental calculations. Was I really worth her time? The doubt in her eyes reminded me of Alexia's carefully controlled expressions, and it steeled my resolve. "Mrs. Carson, please come in. Charles Harrison is eager to speak with you." Charles looked older than I remembered, his once dark hair now silver, but his handshake was as firm as ever. His office still overlooked the river, still smelled faintly of expensive cologne and leather-bound books. As I settled into the chair across from his mahogany desk, I caught him studying me with the same mixture of curiosity and concern that had characterized our relationship since David's death. "Diane, it's been far too long. How are you managing?" "I'm managing quite well, actually. Better than most people realize." He raised an eyebrow at my tone, but remained diplomatically neutral. "I'm glad to hear that. Janet mentioned you're interested in accessing some of your holdings. May I ask what's prompted this decision?" I'd rehearsed this moment during the sleepless hours after my lunch with Alexia, but sitting here now, the words felt different, more final, more deliberately chosen. "I'm planning a significant charitable donation." Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine surprise. "I see. May I ask to which organization?" "The Southeast Asia Children's Future Initiative. I'd like to discuss donating approximately $3.5 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of traffic 15 floors below. Charles picked up a pen and set it down again, a gesture I remembered from the difficult conversations we'd had after David's death when I'd insisted on hiding my financial situation from everyone, including my own children. "Diane," he said carefully, "that's a substantial amount. It would represent roughly 60% of your current liquid assets. I have to ask, have you discussed this with Alexia? Or with any financial advisor?" "I haven't discussed it with anyone because it's my money to give away." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't soften them. "Charles, I've been living like a pauper for 5 years because I wanted my children to make their own way in the world. I wanted them to develop their own sense of accomplishment and self-reliance. That's admirable, but it was a mistake." I leaned forward, my hands flat on his desk. "Do you know what my daughter said to me yesterday? She told me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving because I lack the social fluency to interact with successful people. She's ashamed of me, Charles. Ashamed of her poor, disconnected mother who makes everyone uncomfortable by existing in their presence." Charles set down his pen and studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people's financial anxieties and family dramas. "And you want to make this donation as a response to that conversation?" "I want to make this donation because I've spent 5 years watching my own daughter turn into someone I don't recognize. Someone who measures worth by bank accounts and dismisses people who can't afford Mediterranean cruises. I thought I was teaching her values, but apparently I only taught her to be ashamed of anyone who isn't prosperous enough to meet her standards." The admission hung in the air between us. I'd never said it aloud before, never allowed myself to acknowledge how thoroughly I'd failed as a mother. Not in the ways that mattered. I'd raised Alexia to be intelligent, capable, and independent. But somewhere along the way, I'd also raised her to be cruel. "These children in Southeast Asia," I continued, "they don't have the luxury of worrying about social fluency or appropriate dinner conversation. They need medicine, education, clean water. They need someone to invest in their futures without judging whether they're worthy of inclusion." Charles reached for a leather folder and opened it, revealing the financial statements I hadn't looked at in 2 years. The numbers were still startling, even to me. David's life insurance policy, his pension, the investments we'd made together during 28 years of marriage, all carefully managed and quietly growing while I'd been eating canned soup and shopping at thrift stores. "If you're determined to do this," he said slowly, "we'll need to discuss the tax implications and the timeline for liquidating the necessary assets. But Diane, I have to ask, what happens after? This donation will significantly impact your long-term financial security." I'll still have over $2 million remaining. I think I can manage to live comfortably on that. And your daughter? What will you tell her? The question I'd been avoiding crystallized into something sharp and clean. I'm not going to tell her anything. She's going to find out the same way everyone else does, when the Southeast Asia Children's Future Initiative announces their largest single donation in their organization's history. Charles's eyebrows rose. You're planning to make this public? Very public. I want it announced on the national news. I want my name attached to it. I want everyone who knows Alexia Emerson to understand exactly what kind of money her poor, socially inadequate mother was capable of giving away. For the first time since I'd walked into his office, Charles smiled. Not the professional smile he'd been wearing, but something genuine and slightly admiring. You know, David always said you were tougher than you looked. David never saw his daughter tell me I wasn't good enough to eat at her table. We spent the next hour going through the paperwork, Charles explaining the process of liquidating enough assets to fund my donation while maintaining my long-term financial stability. As we worked, I felt something shifting inside me. Not just anger anymore, but a clear, purposeful satisfaction. For 5 years, I'd been apologizing for my existence, making myself smaller and quieter and more grateful for whatever scraps of attention my family threw my way. Those days were over. When I left Harrison and Associates 3 hours later, the wheels were already in motion. Within 2 weeks, my donation would be processed and announced. The Southeast Asia Children's Future Initiative would hold a press conference, and I would be there, on camera, explaining why I'd chosen to invest in children who had nothing rather than the adults in my life who already had everything. I drove home slowly, taking the scenic route past the neighborhoods where Alexia lived, where her children attended their expensive private schools, where she and Richard hosted dinner parties for their successful friends. Tomorrow, I would begin the second phase of my plan. I would disappear. Not literally. I wasn't running away like a teenager angry at her parents, but I was going to remove myself so completely from Alexia's life that she would finally understand what my absence actually meant. No more awkward holiday invitations declined out of pity. No more guilt-driven phone calls where she asked about my situation, with the tone of someone inquiring about a chronic illness. No more opportunities for her to demonstrate her generosity by including her poor mother in family events where I clearly didn't belong. I would give her exactly what she wanted, a family free from the embarrassment of my financial limitations. And in return, she would learn the true cost of that freedom. That night, I sat down at my computer and began writing emails. To the few friends I still maintained contact with, explaining that I would be traveling for an extended period. To my utility companies, arranging for automatic payments. To my landlord, requesting a temporary suspension of my lease. Alexia had made it clear that I wasn't welcome in her world. It was time to show her what that meant. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the children who would benefit from my donation. Kids who had never had the luxury of taking their next meal for granted, who understood the value of everything they received. Children who would grow up knowing that sometimes, when the world seemed determined to dismiss you, the most powerful response was to prove them wrong. I printed out my boarding pass for the flight to New York, where I would catch a connecting flight to Bangladesh. In 3 days, I would be standing in front of cameras, announcing my commitment to the Southeast Asia Children's Future Initiative. Alexia would be watching. I was certain of that. And for the first time in 5 years, I couldn't wait to see the look on her face. The phone started ringing at 6:47 a.m. I was already awake, standing in my small kitchen with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while I stared out the window at the gray Portland morning. The caller ID showed Alexia's name, and I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. The same physical response I'd developed over years of her calls, each one carrying the potential for fresh disappointment or carefully veiled criticism. But today was different. Today, I had power. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice deliberately steady. "Hello, Alexia." "Mom." Her voice was strained, higher than usual. "Mom, I saw the news, the morning show. They said," she paused, and I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. They said Diane Carson donated $3.5 million to some children's charity in Asia. Please tell me that wasn't you. The words hung between us, loaded with everything she couldn't quite bring herself to say directly. Please tell me you're not the same Diane Carson. Please tell me my poor, socially inadequate mother isn't the woman who just made headlines for her generosity. Please tell me I haven't made a terrible mistake. Yes, I said simply. That was me. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Alexia finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. $3.5 million, Mom. How did you… She stopped, seeming to realize the implications of what she was asking. You've had this money the whole time? Yes. The whole time I've been worrying about you? The whole time you've been living in that tiny apartment? Driving that old car? Shopping at… She trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. Shopping at discount stores, eating at cheap restaurants, declining invitations because I couldn't afford to reciprocate. Yes, Alexia, the whole time. But why? The question came out as almost a wail. Why would you live like that when you didn't have to? Why would you let me think? Why would you let me worry about your finances when you have millions of dollars? I set down my coffee cup and walked to the living room, settling into the worn armchair where I'd spent so many evenings reading library books instead of buying new ones, watching basic cable instead of paying for premium channels, living a carefully constructed life of voluntary poverty, while my daughter developed her theories about my inadequacy. I wanted you and your brother to make your own way in the world, I said. I wanted you to understand the value of work, of building something for yourself. I thought if you knew about the money, you'd never develop your own sense of accomplishment. So you were pretending? All these years you were pretending to be poor? I wasn't pretending anything. I was living modestly while you became successful. I was proud of what you accomplished on your own. But the things you said no to, the trips we invited you on, the restaurants we wanted to take you to, her voice was gaining strength now, anger overtaking shock. You made us feel guilty for having things you couldn't afford. I never asked you to feel guilty. You didn't have to ask. God, Mom, do you have any idea how many times Richard and I talked about whether we should help you financially? How many times I lay awake worrying about what would happen to you if you got sick or had an emergency? The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd worried about my financial vulnerability while excluding me from family gatherings for being insufficiently prosperous. She'd lost sleep over my imaginary poverty while dismissing me as socially inadequate for not contributing to conversations about luxury travel and expensive hobbies. I'm sorry you worried, I said, and meant it. That wasn't my intention. Then what was your intention? Because right now it feels like you've been lying to me for 5 years. My intention was to raise children who valued more than money. Children who would judge people by their character rather than their bank accounts. The words landed with the precision of a surgical strike. I could hear Alexia's sharp intake of breath, could almost see her face as she processed the implication. I don't judge people by their money. Don't you? No, She stopped, and I knew she was remembering. Our conversation at the Meridian. Her careful explanation of why I didn't belong at her Thanksgiving table. Her concern about my inability to contribute to discussions about Mediterranean cruises and charity boards. Alexia, I said gently, 2 days ago you told me I wasn't welcome at your Thanksgiving dinner because I couldn't relate to successful people. You were ashamed of your poor mother who made your in-laws uncomfortable. What am I supposed to think about that? I wasn't ashamed of you being poor. I was worried about you feeling left out. Were you? Or were you worried about me embarrassing you? Another silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was small, defensive. Maybe I handled it badly. But Mom, you have to understand. The way you've been living, the things you say no to, it's like you're from a different world. Richard's parents, they work hard for what they have. And when someone can't participate in the same kinds of activities, someone like me, someone who seems… She struggled with the words. Someone who seems to resent success, who makes other people feel guilty for having nice things. And now that you know I could have had nice things all along, how does that change your perspective? I don't know. Her voice cracked. I honestly don't know what to think anymore. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived quietly for 5 years, invisible to my neighbors, irrelevant to my daughter's social circle. Tomorrow, I would board a plane to Bangladesh. In a week, I would be volunteering at a clinic in Myanmar. In a month, I would be helping to build a school in Cambodia. For the first time in years, my life would have purpose beyond simply existing in the margins of other people's stories. Alexia, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry that you have money or success. I'm proud of what you've built. But I am disappointed that you've learned to measure people's worth by their ability to contribute to conversations about expensive vacations. That's not what I was doing, isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you decided I wasn't good enough for your family based entirely on my apparent financial limitations. And now that you know those limitations were voluntary, you're not apologizing for excluding me. You're angry that I didn't tell you the truth sooner. The accusation hung between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. I could hear Alexia breathing, could picture her in her pristine kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, trying to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the woman who'd just donated more money than most people see in a lifetime. Mom, can we talk about this in person? Can you come over for dinner tonight? I think we need to. I can't. I'm leaving for Bangladesh tomorrow morning. You're what? I'm going to Southeast Asia to work with the Children's Future Initiative. I'll be volunteering at their clinics and schools for the next 3 months. 3 months? Mom, you can't just disappear for 3 months. What about Thanksgiving? What about Christmas? The questions revealed everything I needed to know about Alexia's priorities. Not concern for my well-being or safety. Not curiosity about the children I'd be helping. Just worry about how my absence would affect her holiday plans. I thought you'd already decided I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving. That was before I knew. Things are different now. Are they? Or are you just afraid of how it looks to exclude someone who just made national news for her charitable giving? That's not fair. Isn't it? I could hear her crying now, soft sounds that took me back to her childhood, to scraped knees and broken hearts and all the times when a mother's comfort was enough to fix whatever was wrong. But we weren't children and mothers anymore. We were 2 adults who had failed each other in ways that couldn't be kissed better. Mom, please, don't leave like this. Let me make this right. How? The question came out harder than I intended. How exactly do you plan to make this right, Alexia? Are you going to pretend you didn't exclude me from your family? Are you going to pretend that conversation at the Meridian never happened? I'll apologize. I'll explain to Richard's parents that I made a mistake. And what will you tell your children? What will you tell Emma and Jordan about why their grandmother suddenly became welcome at the family table? She had no answer for that, and we both knew it. I'll be back in March, I said finally. When I return, we can talk about what kind of relationship we want to have going forward. But Alexia, I need you to understand. I'm not the same woman who accepted your judgment 2 days ago. I'm not going to apologize for existing anymore. I hung up before she could respond, my hands steady as I set the phone aside. Outside, the rain had started again. Portland's familiar gray drizzle that had been my companion for 5 years of small, careful living. Tomorrow, I would wake up to sunshine and heat and the voices of children who understood that every gift was precious because nothing was guaranteed. For the first time in years, I was going where I was wanted. The Dhaka airport was a symphony of chaos. Vendors calling in Bengali, families reuniting with tears and laughter, the scent of spices and diesel fuel mixing with the humid air that clung to my skin like a second layer of clothing. After 36 hours of travel, I should have been exhausted, but I felt more awake than I had in years. Donna Albright from the Southeast Asia Children's Future Initiative met me at customs, her weathered face breaking into a genuine smile as she spotted me in the crowd. At 58, she had the kind of purposeful energy that came from decades of meaningful work, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her clothes chosen for function rather than fashion. Diane, welcome to Bangladesh. How was the flight? Long, but worth it. I shouldered my single carry-on bag. I'd learned to pack light during my years of voluntary poverty, and the skill served me well now. I'm ready to get to work. She laughed, a sound full of warmth and approval. That's what I like to hear. Most of our major donors want to make speeches and cut ribbons. You're the first one who's actually asked to volunteer in the field. As we made our way through the crowded terminal, Donna explained the logistics of my 3-month commitment. 2 weeks in Bangladesh working at a medical clinic, a month in Myanmar helping to establish a new school, 6 weeks in Cambodia supporting their nutrition program, and a final week in the Philippines documenting the impact of my donation for the organization's annual report. The media attention from your donation has been incredible, she said as we climbed into a taxi that looked like it had survived several decades of Dhaka traffic. CNN wants to do a follow-up story, and we've had inquiries from 3 other major news outlets. If you're willing, we'd love to arrange some interviews while you're here. Of course. The idea of more publicity, of Alexia seeing additional coverage of her mother's charitable work, held a dark satisfaction I wasn't entirely proud of. But the children's need was real, regardless of my motives, and if my personal drama could bring more attention to their cause, then perhaps something good could come from the wreckage of my relationship with my daughter. The clinic where I would spend my first 2 weeks was located in a neighborhood that would have horrified Alexia. Narrow streets lined with corrugated metal shacks, open sewers, children playing in dirt yards while their mothers washed clothes in plastic tubs. But there was life here, vibrant and immediate, that I hadn't felt in my sanitized American existence. Dr. Hazel DeLaura, the clinic's director, was a tiny woman with fierce eyes and hands that never stopped moving. She'd been working in Southeast Asia for 23 years, and her Bengali was as fluent as her English. Within an hour of my arrival, she'd assigned me to help with intake interviews and basic patient care. "You speak softly," she observed after watching me interact with a young mother who'd brought her fevering toddler for treatment. "The children trust you immediately. Have you worked with sick children before?" "I raised 2 of my own," I said, though the words felt strange. Had I really raised Alexia and her brother Michael? Or had I simply provided for them while they raised themselves? But this is different. These children, they're so grateful for everything. They understand that nothing is guaranteed, Dr. DeLaura said, echoing my own thoughts from days earlier. It makes them appreciate what they receive in ways that children from wealthy families often don't. That evening, I called Charles Harrison from my small room at the volunteer hostel. The connection was poor, his voice crackling through static, but his message was clear. The publicity from my donation was generating interest from other potential donors. The Southeast Asia Children's Future Initiative had received over $200,000 in additional contributions in the week since my announcement. "Your daughter has been trying to reach you," he mentioned casually. "She's called the office 3 times asking for your contact information. What did you tell her?" "That you were traveling and would be in touch when convenient. But Diane, she seemed distressed. Are you sure you don't want to speak with her?" I looked out my small window at the street below, where children were playing soccer with a ball made of bundled rags, their laughter echoing off the narrow walls. Their joy was pure, uncomplicated by social expectations or material comparisons. "I'm sure," I said. The days fell into a rhythm that felt more natural than any routine I'd followed in years. Morning rounds at the clinic, helping to distribute medications and comfort frightened children. Afternoons teaching basic English to teenagers who attended school when they weren't working to support their families. Evenings writing in the journal I'd started keeping, documenting not just the medical work, but my own transformation. On my 10th day in Dhaka, I was helping to treat a 7-year-old girl named Rashida, who'd been brought in with severe malnutrition when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me check. "Mom, this is Emma. Aunt Alexia gave me your number. I hope you're okay. I miss you. Emma." Alexia's 15-year-old daughter, my granddaughter who I barely knew because our interactions had been limited to stilted family gatherings, where I was expected to be grateful for inclusion while staying appropriately invisible. I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Rashida stirred in my arms, and I focused on her instead. This small child who'd known hunger in ways my comfortable American family couldn't imagine. But that evening, after Rashida had been admitted for observation and I'd finished my volunteer duties, I found myself typing a response. "Hello, Emma. I'm fine. I'm in Bangladesh helping sick children. How are you? Her reply came within minutes. That's so cool. Mom's been crying a lot since you left. She won't tell me why, but Jordan thinks it's because of something she said to you. Did you guys fight? The directness of teenagers. No careful diplomatic language, no strategic omissions. Just honest curiosity about the family drama that had clearly disrupted their household's equilibrium. We had a disagreement about some family plans. Sometimes adults need time apart to think about things. Are you coming back for Christmas? Mom keeps asking, but she won't call you directly. She's being weird about it. I set the phone aside without answering and walked to the hostel's small rooftop terrace, where other volunteers gathered in the evenings to share stories from their work. Tonight, a young nurse from Germany was describing her day at the pediatric ward, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of meaningful work. The children here, they recover so much faster than children in German hospitals, she was saying. I think it's because they're so grateful to feel better. They don't take healing for granted. My daughter takes everything for granted, I found myself saying, surprising everyone, including myself. She's successful, accomplished, has a beautiful family. But she's learned to measure people's worth by their bank accounts. That's common in wealthy countries, observed Joan Eshu, a veteran volunteer from Canada. When basic needs are always met, people start inventing new requirements for acceptance. Social class, education level, career success. They forget that the most important thing is simply being kind to each other. I thought if I lived modestly, she would learn to value character over money. Instead, she learned to dismiss people who couldn't afford expensive hobbies. So you're teaching her a different lesson now? Joan's question was gentle but pointed. I'm showing her what she actually lost when she decided I wasn't good enough for her family. And what did she lose? The question hung in the humid air while I considered my answer. What had Alexia lost? A mother who would have funded her children's college educations without being asked. A grandmother who could have taken Emma and Jordan on educational trips around the world. A family member who would have quietly paid for home repairs, medical emergencies, or any financial crisis that arose. But more than that, she'd lost someone who would have loved her unconditionally, regardless of her success or failure. Someone who would have supported her through difficulties without judgment. Someone who would have been genuinely proud of her accomplishments rather than resentful of her prosperity. She lost a mother, I said finally, and she chose to lose her rather than expand her definition of what makes someone worthy of inclusion. Will you forgive her? I don't know. Right now, I'm more interested in figuring out who I am when I'm not apologizing for existing. That night, I wrote in my journal, Day 10 in Dhaka. Treated 47 patients today. A little girl named Rashida smiled for the first time since her admission. Her mother cried with relief. I realized I haven't thought about Alexia's opinion of me for 3 days. This is what it feels like to be needed rather than tolerated. The next morning brought a CNN news crew to the clinic. They wanted to interview me about my donation and my hands-on involvement with the organization. As I sat in the clinic's small office, surrounded by medical supplies purchased with my money, I thought about Alexia watching this coverage from her comfortable home in Portland. Mrs. Carson, the reporter asked, what motivated you to make such a substantial donation to children's charities in Southeast Asia, rather than supporting causes closer to home? I looked through the window at the children waiting for treatment, at the volunteers from around the world who'd come here not for recognition, but for purpose. These children understand that everything they receive is a gift, I said. They're grateful for medicine, for education, for the simple fact that someone cares about their well-being. They don't judge the value of a gift by the giver's social status or wealth. They just know that someone chose to help them when they desperately needed help. And that matters to you? It matters to me more than anything else in the world. As the camera rolled, I found myself thinking not about Alexia, but about Rashida, who would go home healthy because someone had cared enough to make sure she received treatment. About the teenagers I was teaching English to, who would have better opportunities because someone believed in their potential. For the first time in 5 years, I was exactly where I belonged. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't care whether my daughter approved. 3 months later, I stood in the departure lounge at Manila Airport, watching the rain streak down the windows while I waited for my flight back to Portland. My hands were darker from the sun, my body leaner from the physical demands of volunteer work, my hair shorter after a practical cut from a village barber in Cambodia. But the most significant changes weren't visible. In my carry-on bag was a folder thick with photographs and letters. Rashida, fully recovered, grinning beside her mother outside their small home. The teenage students from my English classes in Myanmar, several of whom had already been accepted to universities they could never have attended without the language skills we'd worked on together. The nutrition program children in Cambodia, whose growth charts showed steady progress after months of proper meals funded by my donation. But the letter that meant the most to me was handwritten on simple notebook paper, signed by 43 children from the school we'd built in a remote Philippine village. They'd each written a single sentence in carefully practiced English. "Thank you for believing we are worth helping." Worth helping. The phrase had echoed in my mind during the long flight across the Pacific. These children, who had nothing, understood their own worth in ways that my successful, comfortable daughter never had. They didn't question whether they deserved education or healthcare or nutritious food. They simply accepted these gifts with the kind of profound gratitude that comes from understanding how precarious everything really is. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the journey. Missed calls from Alexia, text messages from Emma and Jordan, even a voicemail from Michael, my son who lived in Seattle and rarely involved himself in family drama. I'd read Emma's messages, each one growing more urgent. "Grandma, please call. Mom's really upset. She keeps talking about making mistakes but won't explain what happened. Jordan says she's been looking at plane tickets to Asia but Dad won't let her come find you. Please just let us know you're okay. We're worried." The concern in my granddaughter's words was genuine, uncomplicated by the social calculations and wounded pride that characterized every interaction with Alexia. Emma simply wanted to know that her grandmother was safe and when she might see her again. It was the kind of uncomplicated love I'd been receiving from the children in Southeast Asia for 3 months. As my plane began its descent into Portland, I made a decision. I would see Emma and Jordan, but Alexia would have to earn her way back into my life if she wanted to be there at all. The apartment I returned to felt like a museum exhibit from someone else's life. Everything exactly as I'd left it. The worn furniture I'd grown comfortable with, the small kitchen where I'd heated so many cans of soup, the single bedroom where I'd spent countless evenings reading library books instead of buying new ones. But I was no longer the woman who had lived this carefully diminished life. I'd been home for exactly 47 minutes when Alexia knocked on my door. She looked terrible, thinner than when I'd left, with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of drawn expression that came from months of interrupted sleep. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a careless ponytail, and she wore jeans and a simple sweater instead of her typical polished professional attire. "Mom," her voice cracked on the single word. "You're back." I'm back. I didn't invite her in, didn't step aside to let her enter. We stood in my doorway like strangers negotiating the terms of an uncomfortable transaction. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 months. I know. The CNN story, the follow-up articles. I've watched everything. I've read every interview." She paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "The children you helped, the schools and clinics. I'm proud of what you did. Are you? Or are you proud that your mother isn't the embarrassment you thought she was?" The question hit its mark. Alexia flinched as if I'd slapped her, her careful composure cracking completely. "I never thought you were an embarrassment. You told me I lacked the social fluency to interact with successful people. You said I made your in-laws uncomfortable by existing in their presence. What would you call that?" "I would call it the biggest mistake of my life." The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw. "Mom, I've replayed that conversation 1,000 times. I've lost sleep. I've cried until I made myself sick. She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I've realized that I turned into someone I don't recognize, someone cruel." I studied her face, looking for the manipulation I'd learned to expect, the careful calibration of emotion designed to achieve a specific result. But what I saw was something I hadn't seen from Alexia in years. Genuine vulnerability. "What do you want from me, Alexia?" "I want—" She stopped, seeming to realize that the easy answers wouldn't work here. I want to understand how I became someone who could say those things to her own mother. I want to know how to undo the damage I've done. Her voice broke completely. I want my mom back. Which mother do you want back? The poor one who made you feel guilty for your success? Or the wealthy one who might fund your children's college educations? That's not fair, isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you only became interested in repairing our relationship after you learned about my money. Alexia was crying now, tears streaming down her face without any attempt to hide them. You're right. God help me. You're right. When I first found out about the money, my immediate thought was relief. Relief that I didn't have to worry about your finances anymore. Relief that you could afford to participate in family activities. Relief that I wouldn't have to feel guilty about having things you couldn't afford. And now? Now I've spent 3 months watching news coverage of you helping children who have nothing, children who were grateful for medicine and education and basic nutrition, children who didn't judge whether you were worthy of helping them. They just accepted your kindness and gave you their love in return. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and I realized that those children got the mother I threw away. They got your generosity, your compassion, your time, because I decided you weren't good enough to eat at my table. The admission hung between us, brutal in its honesty. For the first time in our adult relationship, Alexia was taking full responsibility for her actions without excuse or qualification. Emma has been asking about you every day, she continued. Jordan keeps wondering when you're coming to dinner again. They don't understand why their grandmother disappeared. And I can't explain it to them because the truth makes me sound like a monster. What is the truth, Alexia? The truth is that I became someone who values the wrong things. Someone who inherited Dad's business sense but not his heart. Someone who forgot that the most successful person I ever knew was my mother, who raised 2 children and supported her husband's career, and still had enough love left over to donate millions of dollars to help kids she'd never met. She paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever came next. The truth is that I want to be the kind of person those children in Asia think you are. Someone who helps without expecting anything in return. Someone who judges people by their kindness rather than their bank accounts. Someone worthy of being your daughter. I looked past her to the street where I'd lived quietly for 5 years, invisible and dismissed. Then I thought about the children I'd left behind in Southeast Asia, who would grow up knowing that sometimes, when the world seems indifferent to your existence, someone might still choose to invest in your future. Alexia, I said finally, I'm not the same person I was when I left Portland. I'm not going to apologize for existing anymore. I'm not going to make myself smaller to make other people comfortable. And I'm not going to pretend that what happened between us doesn't matter. I don't want you to pretend. I want you to give me the chance to earn your forgiveness. How? However you'll let me. Whatever it takes. I stepped aside and opened my door wider. Come in. I want to tell you about a little girl named Rashida, who taught me that gratitude and love are the only currencies that actually matter. As Alexia entered my small apartment, I saw her taking in the modest furnishings with new eyes. Not judgment now, but something closer to understanding. She settled onto my worn couch with the careful attention of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Tell me about all of them, she said. Tell me about every child you helped. I want to understand what I cost us both when I decided you weren't worthy of my family. So I did. I told her about Rashida and the English students and the nutrition program children. I showed her photographs and read her letters. I described the gratitude that had surrounded me every day for 3 months, the sense of purpose I'd found in being genuinely needed rather than merely tolerated. And as I talked, I watched my daughter's face transform. Not back into the child she'd once been, but into someone new. Someone who was finally beginning to understand the difference between having worth and recognizing it in others. Mom, she said when I finished, would you consider having Thanksgiving dinner with us this year? Not because you can afford to contribute to the conversation about expensive travel, but because we need you there. Because Emma and Jordan need their grandmother, and I need to remember what it feels like to have a mother who's proud of me for the right reasons. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her. For the first time in years. She was still successful, still polished, still living a life of comfort and privilege. But something fundamental had shifted. The calculating coldness that had characterized our recent interactions was gone, replaced by something softer and more honest. "I'll think about it," I said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was possibility. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough.